What's the darkest side of humanity you've ever seen? Story 1. Ex-social worker. One young woman immigrated here from a country in Africa. She busted her butt working 3 jobs so she could help family members immigrate to the US. And she got a lot of them over. Then she started developing MH symptoms commonly associated with schizophrenia. Her entire family dumped her in the homeless shelter with nothing. A limited grasp of English, no possessions, no medical paperwork, and she's hallucinating and terrified. Story 2. I worked at a charity event at a golf course. I was hired to make cocktails on the 9th hole. Overhearing the VP of Nestle's brag about hooking people on their products from birth to death, and then said something to the effect of, if you want to be a powerhouse in business, you have to take pride in your firing. The first thing you should do once you get the right position is seek out your hero in that company. Then fire him. Always fire your heroes. It feels great and lets the people know that you mean business. Just creepy to hear out loud. Story 3. I went into the Atlanta Constitution building, which has been abandoned for nearly 40 years in the middle of Atlanta. The cops put out word everyone needed to clear out, and the SWAT team and fire department had to clear the building and make paths for us to make an engineering assessment. We had to wear gloves, Tyvek suits, rubber boots, and respirators to enter the building. And once inside, I could see why. Over 30 to 40 years, the place was only abandoned by the owners, but dozens of people were living there with no water, power, waste disposal. There were mounds of trash and feces 8 feet high, filling entire rooms. You could see where some poor soul had a couple pallets, a sleeping bag, a bucket of crap, and a few pots they cooked with. The basement was a flooded lake of garbage, and the first few floors were dark and disgusting. As you went up, it was more like drug dens with broken liquor bottles. It was like an apocalypse happened decades ago. Story 4. Most cruelty doesn't come from monsters. It comes from people explaining themselves. It's necessary. It's for the greater good. I didn't have a choice. And just as often, it comes from everyone else deciding it's safer, easier, or more comfortable to look away. Silence becomes a kind of currency. You trade it for stability, belonging, or not becoming the next target. What makes it truly unsettling is how ordinary it is. No villain speeches, no dramatic turning points, just small justifications stacking up until harm feels normal and resistance feels risky. Systems learn this. Institutions depend on it. Abuse survives on it. And once you've lived through it, once you've seen how fear shuts mouths and benefits smooths consciences, you can't unsee it. You start noticing how often that's just how things are is really, this hurts someone but not me. The bleak part is how common it is. The hopeful part, quiet but real, is that people who see this pattern are often the ones who break it later. Naming it matters. Refusing to normalize it matters. Even remembering that silence isn't neutrality, that matters. Cruelty thrives in the dark, but awareness is already light. Story 5. It isn't just the ability to cause pain that exists everywhere in nature. Predators hurt prey without understanding it as suffering. Accidents happen without intent. But what you're pointing at is something uniquely human. The ability to model another mind, to know that it feels fear, pain, humiliation, and to use that knowledge as leverage. That requires empathy first. You have to understand another being well enough to imagine their inner experience. And then you have to turn that understanding off selectively, or twist it into a tool. That's what makes it chilling. The same cognitive machinery that allows compassion also allows cruelty to become precise. This is why the worst harm is often psychological. Physical pain ends. Psychological pain lingers because it targets meaning, safety, identity. Someone who knows exactly where it hurts doesn't need to be strong or loud. They just need access. What's especially unsettling is how often this is justified as discipline, necessity, tradition, love, or order. The act isn't framed as cruelty, it's framed as correction. And once it's framed that way, people can sleep at night. But the flip side matters too. That same capacity to recognize suffering in another is also what makes restraint, care, and solidarity possible. The line between the two isn't intelligence. It's choice, context, and whether power is checked or allowed to roam. Story 6. People who constantly announce how moral they are usually need the announcement to do the work for them. Real virtue is quiet because it doesn't need witnesses. It shows up in inconvenient moments, when no one's watching, when there's something to lose. If someone is always telling you how good they are, it's fair to ask who they're trying to convince. And the line about vices is uncomfortably true. A person with no acknowledged flaws isn't clean. They're opaque. Everyone has impulses, contradictions, weak spots. Someone who admits them has at least looked inward. Someone who claims purity has probably just buried things deep enough to deny them, which is where they come out sideways. Judgment, control, cruelty framed as righteousness. The most dangerous people aren't the openly flawed ones. They're the ones who believe, or want you to believe, that they're above temptation. That's how hypocrisy becomes invisible even to the person committing it. Integrity isn't about being spotless. It's about knowing where you're capable of failing and choosing restraint anyway, without applause. Story 7. Power doesn't just corrupt, it selects. The people most comfortable pursuing absolute control are often the ones least troubled by what they'll have to do to get it or keep it. They're willing to compromise early, justify harm, silence others, or bend reality to protect themselves. By the time they reach the top, the corruption isn't new. It's just unrestrained. That's why systems built around unchecked authority fail so predictably. It's not that power turns good people bad overnight. It's that the structure rewards traits like ruthlessness, certainty, and self-interest, while pushing out people who hesitate, doubt themselves, or care too much about consequence. Over time, the system becomes a filter that leaves only the most damaged or dangerous personalities standing. And once absolute power exists, it removes the last friction that keeps those traits in check. No accountability, no correction, no reason to listen. At that point, whatever was already broken gets amplified, not challenged. The unsettling part is that this isn't a moral flaw unique to bad eras or nations. It's a human pattern, which is why the healthiest systems aren't built on trusting leaders to be virtuous. They're built on assuming leaders will be tempted, limited, and fallible. Power needs boundaries not because people are evil, but because enough of them are human. Story 8. Policies don't harm people by accident most of the time. The impacts are modeled, forecasted, debated in closed rooms. The suffering is acknowledged, then reframed as acceptable, necessary, or unavoidable. Harm becomes an externality, a statistic, something that happens to others. What makes it worse is how responsibility dissolves. No single person feels accountable. It's the committee, the party, the system, the voters, the budget, the timeline. Everyone's hands are just clean enough to sleep at night. And if the people affected are distant, marginalized, or powerless, the moral cost drops even further. It's not always malice. Sometimes it's career preservation. Sometimes it's ideology. Sometimes it's fear of backlash or losing power. But the result is the same. People get hurt, and the people making the decision go home untouched. That's why political harm feels so cold. It's not rage or cruelty at the moment. It's calm, justified procedural suffering. Pain administered with spreadsheets and press releases. Once you see that, it's hard not to become cynical. But it also explains why accountability, transparency, and limits on power matter so much. Not because leaders are uniquely evil, but because systems that allow harm without consequence will always drift toward using it. Indifference, scaled up, can be just as destructive as intent. Story 9. History isn't a moral record. It's a power record. The people who win wars, control institutions, or survive long enough to tell the story get to decide what's remembered, what's justified, and what's quietly omitted. Good becomes whatever aligns with the outcome. Necessary replaces harmful. Atrocities get renamed as strategy, progress, or order. The losing side doesn't disappear because they were wrong. They disappear because they lose the ability to speak. Their documents are destroyed, their leaders executed, their narratives dismissed as propaganda or bitterness. Even when they weren't better or worse, just human, their version fades. What's especially unsettling is how clean the final story often looks. Complex situations get flattened into heroes and villains. Gray becomes black and white. That makes the past easier to digest and much harder to learn from. The dangerous part isn't just that history is written by the winners, it's that later generations mistake victory for virtue. Once that happens, people stop questioning power because it already proved itself. And the same patterns repeat, with new winners, new justifications, and new people written out of the story. The only defense against that is skepticism. Reading between lines, listening for who's missing. Not to flip the story and crown new heroes, but to remember that morality doesn't travel automatically with success, and that the loudest version of history is rarely the most complete one. Story 10. We like to tell ourselves that humanity progresses, but what really progresses is technology and storytelling. The core drives stay the same: fear, desire for power, tribal loyalty, insecurity, the need to feel righteous. We don't eliminate them. We just learn to dress them up in better language. What used to be conquest becomes security. What used to be cruelty becomes policy. What used to be superstition becomes certain. So history repeats, not because we forget it, but because we keep telling ourselves this time is different. The illusion changes, the justification improves, the tools get cleaner. The harm often gets more abstract, which makes it easier to deny. That said, there's a narrow crack of light in the pattern. While humanity as a whole may not get better, individuals sometimes do. Awareness exists now in a way it didn't before. People can name patterns, call them out, resist them locally, even if they can't stop them globally. Maybe progress isn't the absence of repetition. Maybe it's the number of people who recognize the illusion while it's happening and refuse to fully believe it. That doesn't save the world, but it does keep it from owning everyone. And sometimes, that's the only kind of improvement our species seems capable of. Story 11. Humans didn't rise to dominance by being gentle. We're successful because, when threatened, we're capable of extreme violence, and worse, of rationalizing it. We don't just end enemies, we redefine them until killing feels justified. Once that happens, age, innocence, and even humanity itself stop being protective categories. History is full of moments where entire populations were reframed as obstacles rather than people. What separates us from other animals isn't brutality alone, it's organized brutality. Planning it, teaching it, recording it, turning it into policy, doctrine, or destiny. That's how annihilation becomes something people can live with afterward. It had to be done. They would have done it to us. This is how the world works. But that same trait is also why our survival feels so fragile. A species that wins by annihilating threats eventually runs out of enemies and starts turning that machinery inward. The tools don't disappear just because the justification does. So yes, brutality helped us survive. The question that hangs over everything now is whether the trait that carried us this far is the same one that eventually makes us impossible to live with, even for ourselves. History suggests that being able to do something is not the same as being able to stop doing it. Story 12. Conflict isn't just about enemies, it's about identity. When there's a common enemy, lines are clear. Purpose is shared. Differences get papered over because survival demands cooperation. The moment that external pressure disappears, the glue dissolves. Old fractures reappear. New ones form. People start asking who gets what now, who belongs, who decides. And it cuts both ways, like you said. Groups that hate each other will set that aside instantly if a bigger threat appears. Not because they've reconciled, but because alignment is useful. Once the threat is gone, the alliance collapses, sometimes more violently than before. Peace was never the goal, advantage was. That's why true peace is such a slippery idea. At scale, it would require humans to stop organizing around us versus them thinking, status, fear, and competition for resources. And those aren't learned behaviors layered on top of us, they're ancient wiring. What we call peace is usually just a pause, a balance of power, a moment where the costs of fighting outweigh the benefits. It can be long, even prosperous, but it's conditional. That doesn't mean nothing matters. It means peace isn't a destination, it's maintenance. Fragile, local, temporary, and always under threat from the same instincts that once kept us alive. The uncomfortable truth may be that conflict is the default, and peace is the exception we keep trying to stretch. And the fact that we keep trying, even knowing how it usually ends, might be the most human thing about us. Story 13. A lot of people don't think of themselves as selfish. They think of themselves as reasonable, just taking what they deserve, doing what they have to do. And that's how selfishness stretches without limit, because it's almost never framed as cruelty in the person's own head. It's framed as survival, ambition, efficiency, or not my problem. What's especially grim is how small the payoff often is. Not survival, not safe. Just a little comfort, a little advantage, a moment of feeling ahead. People will cut someone off, undercut a coworker, neglect a family member, or look away from harm for something as thin as convenience. An ounce of satisfaction, like you said, and once they get away with it, it reinforces itself. The world didn't end, no one stopped them. So the next step is easier. Over time, empathy becomes optional, something you perform when it's cheap and discard when it isn't. But here's the part that matters. Noticing this pattern doesn't mean you're doomed to repeat it. People who are disturbed by selfishness are usually the ones who've felt the cost of it. They hesitate. They check themselves. They remember there are other people in the frame. That doesn't make life easier. It often makes it harder, but it does mean that not everyone is optimized for stepping on others. And that restraint, even when it goes unrewarded, is a quiet refusal to let the worst human defaults run the whole show. Selfishness may be common, it isn't inevitable. Story 14. Homo sapiens didn't just survive alongside other human species. We replaced them. Neanderthals, Denisovans, others we barely know the names of anymore. Whether through competition, violence, disease, or absorption, the end result is the same. We're the only ones left. And once that pattern was set, it didn't stop at our own kind. Wherever humans went, large mammals disappeared. Not always intentionally, not always maliciously, but consistently. Ecosystems collapsed under our pressure. Species that couldn't adapt to our speed, tools, or appetite vanished. The few animals we kept weren't spared out of kindness. We shaped them into resources, tools, symbols, companions, things that fit into our lives. Cats and dogs survived because they were useful, comforting, or entertaining. Livestock survived because they fed us. Everything else had to fight for shrinking margins. What makes this unsettling isn't just the damage, it's the selectivity. We decide which lives are worth preserving and under what conditions. Existence becomes conditional on usefulness to us. That doesn't mean humans are uniquely evil. It means we're uniquely powerful without being uniquely wise. Our instincts evolved for survival in small groups, not stewardship of a planet. Scale broke the balance. The uncomfortable question isn't why did we do this? It's whether a species that rose by erasing competitors and reshaping the world around itself can ever fully learn to stop doing that once it no longer needs to. And whether restraint can become as defining as dominance. Story 15. We can split atoms, map genomes, land probes on other planets, and still haven't solved what to do with our own leftovers. We produce waste faster than we can think about it, then push it out of sight and call that management. Landfills, oceans, poorer communities, the future, somewhere else absorbs the cost. What makes it unsettling is that this isn't a technical mystery. We know how to reduce waste, reuse materials, and design circular systems. The problem isn't ignorance. It's scale, convenience, profit, and short time horizons. Trash is the physical record of decisions optimized for now, not later. Plastic will outlive us. Microplastics are already inside our bodies. Toxic waste sits sealed with warning signs written for civilizations that don't exist yet. We're leaving behind artifacts we don't fully understand and can't safely undo. In a way, waste is our real monument, not pyramids or cities, but layers of garbage marking our presence in the geological record. Future beings won't wonder if we were advanced. They'll see that we were productive, fast, and careless. It's uncomfortable because it suggests a species smart enough to transform the planet, but not disciplined enough to clean up after itself. And that gap between capability and responsibility might be one of the most dangerous things about us. Story 16. You're not plugged into pods, but you're embedded in systems you didn't choose and can't really opt out of. Economic pressure dictates where you live, how much rest you get, what risks you can afford to take. Algorithms shape what you see, what you get angry about, what you think is normal. Culture tells you what success looks like long before you're old enough to question it. By the time you do, most paths are already narrowed. That's why the Matrix lands. Not because of simulated reality, but because of manufactured consent. You feel free because you can choose between options, but the menu was set long before you arrived. Most control today doesn't come from force. It comes from incentives, fear of falling behind, social pressure, and distraction. You don't have to be watched constantly if you internalize the rules yourself. And like the movie, the hardest part isn't escape, it's recognition. Once you see how much of your behavior is shaped, nudged, optimized, and monetized, you can't unsee it. But seeing it doesn't magically free you either. You still need to eat, work, participate. So freedom becomes smaller and quieter, not overthrowing the system, just carving out moments of genuine choice, awareness, refusal to fully buy the illusion. The Matrix wasn't wrong. It just made the cages obvious and the villains visible. Real life is subtler, and that's why it works. Story 17. Private equity. People don't realize just how much of a cancer they are. They will eventually bring about 2008 like a market crash. PEs that especially focus on leveraged buyouts are especially cancerous. They buy out companies to purposefully load them up with debt and drain the company using complex financial loopholes, and then sell them off or foreclose. Basically, they have effectively averted many of the rules and red tapes placed after the 2008 crisis by doing shady and unethical practices as private firms. Story 18. The news is only relevant because they play on your emotions. They instill fear and propaganda into the population. Everyone eats it up. Some eat it up all day and repeat the same words, without factual evidence, and take it as fact. If the news spoke about how it's a beautiful summer day, and the whales are voyaging by on a certain day, and the sea turtles are hatching, then people would lose interest, and the news stations would be irrelevant. I don't care what political theater arts club you agree with, but this is a fact, and it's time for everyone to realize it. You've been brainwashed. Story 19. The government doesn't give a crap about you. To them, you are mechanisms by which they make money, through taxation, healthcare, outrageous cost of living, etc. Pawns to be destroyed in their games of war. Enjoy what you have, love your nearest and dearest, for they do not. Be kind, don't be like them. We've only got one each other in the end. When systems fail to care, care becomes a human responsibility. Kindness, loyalty, love, those aren't naive reactions, they're acts of resistance. Choosing to be decent in a world that often rewards indifference is how people keep their humanity intact. It's how meaning survives scale. You're right about one thing in particular. What lasts isn't policy or power, it's connection. The people you love, the way you treat strangers, the moments you refuse to harden even when it would be easier. We don't get to control the system, but we do get to decide whether we mirror its cruelty or refuse to let it finish the job. And in the end, that refusal, quiet, imperfect, human, is what keeps us from becoming just another mechanism too. Story 20. We claim intelligence, morality, even superiority, yet inflict suffering on beings that are completely at our mercy, often not out of necessity but convenience, profit, or habit. Factory farming, animal testing done for marginal gains, habitat destruction that wipes out entire species without a second thought. It's all built on the assumption that power equals permission. What makes it especially damning is that we know animals feel pain, fear, stress, attachment. We've proven it scientifically. There's no ignorance to hide behind anymore. And still, the system grinds on because exploitation is efficient and invisible to most people who benefit from it. The quote, often attributed to Gandhi, whether or not he actually said it, hits because it reframes greatness away from wealth, military power, or technology. It asks a simpler question. How do you treat those who can't fight back, can't vote, can't demand rights? By that measure, a lot of modern societies fail badly. And maybe that's the uncomfortable truth. The way we treat animals isn't a side issue or a niche moral concern. It's a preview, a demonstration of how we handle vulnerability when there's no consequence for cruelty. If empathy stops at our own species, it's not really empathy. It's tribalism with better PR. Story 21. We're exposed to poisons not through malice in a single moment, but through accumulation. Pesticides, PFAS, microplastics, heavy metals, endocrine disruptors, things added for efficiency, preservation, convenience, or profit, seeping into food and water a little at a time. No dramatic symptoms at first, just subtle shifts. Hormone disruption, fertility issues, autoimmune problems, cancers that appear decades later with no clear culprit. What makes it worse is that much of it is known. Regulators often understand the risks, but act too slowly or too weakly. Chemicals are approved, then restricted years later after damage is already widespread. The burden of proof falls on the public, not the producers. And once something is in the water table, it's effectively permanent on human timescales. It's a kind of distributed harm. No single villain, no single moment to point to, just a system that prioritizes short-term gain over long-term health. The people most affected are usually those with the least power to avoid it. That's what's unsettling. You can't opt out easily. You still have to eat. You still have to drink water. The danger isn't just the toxins themselves. It's realizing that our environment is being quietly altered faster than our ability or willingness to protect ourselves from the consequences. Story 22. War used to arrive slowly. Letters, grainy photos, names read aloud. Now it shows up between ads and memes, flattened into numbers and footage we weren't meant to process at this speed. When suffering becomes constant background noise, the brain does what it has to do to survive. It dulls the edges. Not because we don't care, but because caring fully about everything would break us. The problem is what that dulling does over time. Atrocity stops feeling exceptional. Death becomes abstract, cities burn, and it registers the same way as a bad forecast. And once something stops shocking us, it stops demanding action. Indifference doesn't start as cruelty, it starts as exhaustion. What's really unsettling is that this numbness is functional. Systems run better when outrage burns out quickly, when empathy has a short half-life, when people scroll instead of stop. You don't need to convince anyone that war is good. You just need them to accept it as normal. But the fact that you notice the numbness matters. It means you haven't fully surrendered to it. Feeling disturbed by the loss of feeling is still feeling. Wars end. Cities rebuild. But a society that grows comfortable watching suffering from a distance risks losing something harder to restore: the reflex to care before it's too late. Staying human now doesn't mean carrying every tragedy. It means refusing to let "this is just how it is" become the final thought. Story 23. Positions of power require trust to function, but they also create distance from consequences. The more authority someone has, the fewer people can challenge them, and the easier it becomes to replace accountability with image. Trust stops being something they earn and becomes something they're granted by default, because the role demands it. That's where the danger creeps in. Power attracts people who want control, status, insulation. Not all of them, but enough. And once someone is wrapped in uniforms, titles, credentials, or for your own good language, doubt starts to feel inappropriate. Questioning them becomes framed as disloyalty, ignorance, or threat. What's especially unsettling is that abuse of power rarely looks like overt evil. It looks like confidence, like certainty, like someone telling you not to worry. The more you're told you can trust me, the more carefully you should pay attention to whether that trust is being backed by transparency, limits, and consequences. This doesn't mean everyone in power is corrupt. It means trust should scale down as power scales up. Not because of paranoia, but because humans don't become better just because they're elevated. Healthy systems don't rely on faith in individuals. They rely on friction, oversight, and the assumption that anyone, given enough unchecked authority, will eventually mistake their position for entitlement. Real trust isn't demanded. It's constrained, tested, and constantly earned. Story 24. More times than not, people don't see people. They see labels. They love categorizing and generalizing. Until you speak to one individual, you are not like the others. Or, you are one of the good ones, but the rest are still part of your view of the label until proven the opposite, which is wrong. And the label, be it nationality, orientation, religion, political stand, or whatever. People so easily jump into hating a whole group because of a disagreement, or some bad people who are part of it. Forgetting they are speaking to another human being who may love the same shows or books that you do, have a family just like you do, have a life just like you do. But the label makes people not see the person. They don't see the individual with their own thoughts. They see the labels. And labels are not. People are people, and you have good and bad everywhere. Your own labels still have some crappy people under it. Story 25. Money stopped being a tool a long time ago. It used to represent tangible things. Labor, goods, scarcity. Now it's layers of abstraction stacked on abstraction. Credit, debt, derivatives, inflation, interest, algorithms. So far removed from real work and real value that most people only experience money as pressure. Bills due, rent rising, time traded for numbers that never seem to stabilize. That's how you end up with modern slavery that doesn't look like chains. You're technically free, but your choices are constrained by debt, cost of living, healthcare tied to employment, and the constant threat of falling behind. You don't have to be forced to use self-discipline, self-police, self-exploit. The system doesn't need violence when dependence does the job. And you're right about the order of operations. You can't fix housing, healthcare, education, climate, or labor, while the underlying money system rewards extraction over well-being. As long as money is created through debt, hoarded at the top, and treated as an end rather than a means, every reform gets bent back toward preserving the same hierarchy. What makes it especially insidious is how opaque it is. Most people sense something's wrong, but the mechanics are intentionally complex. Confusion breeds resignation. If you don't understand the rules, you assume the problem is you. Fixing money wouldn't magically make people good, but it would remove one of the strongest incentives for cruelty, exploitation, and endless growth at all costs. Story 26. Power concentrates. Wealth concentrates. And once that happens, decisions stop being about what's good for most people and start being about what protects the position of the few who already have leverage. Wars, resource extraction, trade policies, labor conditions. Again and again, you see the same pattern. Ordinary people pay the cost while the upside flows upward. The justifications change, the language gets cleaner, but the incentives stay the same. What makes it feel especially maddening is that scarcity is often artificial. We produce more food than we need. We have the technology to house, educate, and heal far more people than we do. The limits aren't physical, they're political and economic. Access is gated, power is hoarded, and those at the top are insulated enough that the consequences don't touch them directly. That doesn't mean everyone with wealth or influence is malicious, but systems built around accumulation reward behaviors that prioritize profit, control, and stability over human well-being. Once you see that, it's hard not to feel angry or helpless. Still, it matters how you carry that awareness. Letting it turn into bitterness only benefits the same structures you're criticizing. What does matter is staying grounded in solidarity, remembering that most people aren't the enemy, even when they're trapped in the same system. The world may be shaped from the top down, but meaning, care, and resistance tend to grow sideways, between people who refuse to accept that this is the only way things can be. Story 27. It looks like normal life getting a little harder every year. Rent is creeping up. Jobs demand more for less. People delay kids, relationships, rest, hope. Everything still functions, so it feels invisible. By the time it's obvious, the damage is already locked in. South Korea really is a warning shot. On paper, it's successful. Advanced tech, global brands, high education. Underneath, it's crushing pressure, unaffordable housing, extreme competition, loneliness, burnout, and one of the lowest birth rates on Earth. Not because people don't want life, but because the system made life feel impossible. No explosion, no revolution, just quiet demographic and psychological collapse. That's what corporate greed and corruption excel at now, slow extraction. They don't break society outright. They drain it until people are too tired, divided, or precarious to push back. And because it happens incrementally, everyone adapts instead of resists. Normalization is the trap. What's terrifying is how subtle it is. By the time you can point to it clearly, you're already inside it. The system doesn't need to convince people it's good, only that there's no alternative, no time, no energy to fight it. You're not wrong to feel urgency. The window to change course is always earlier than people think, and later than they act. History shows that societies usually don't fall because no one warned them. Story 28. A huge share of the world's cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and a significant portion of it is mined by hand in informal operations where children work in tunnels that collapse, breathe toxic dust, and handle materials that poison their bodies over time. Kids as young as 6. Not hidden, known. Documented, repeatedly reported. What makes it especially grim is the language wrapped around it. Green energy, sustainability, the future. We tell ourselves these technologies are morally cleaner, while the dirtiest part of the process is pushed as far out of sight as possible. The harm doesn't disappear. It's just exported to people with the least power to refuse it. And just like with sweatshops or blood diamonds, responsibility gets diffused. Corporations point to suppliers. Governments point to markets. Consumers point to necessity. Everyone benefits. No one feels fully accountable. That's how exploitation survives in plain sight. The kids don't get a choice. They don't get the future we're supposedly building. They get shorter lives so others can feel better about progress. The uncomfortable truth is that ethical consumption under this system is almost impossible by design, which means the real issue isn't individual guilt, it's whether we're willing to demand systems that don't require child suffering as an input. Story 29. Humans don't just occupy space, we claim it. We draw lines on land and call them borders. We fence ecosystems, name species, assign ownership, decide what lives, what dies, what's useful, and what's disposable. Other humans get sorted the same way. Different labels, same impulse. What's unsettling is how far it extends beyond the physical world. We colonize ideas, identities, narratives. We decide which stories are legitimate, which beliefs are acceptable, which ways of being are normal. Even imagination gets partitioned, monetized, regulated. Thought itself becomes territory. The belief in superiority is what lubricates all of it. Intelligence becomes justification. Technology becomes permission. Progress becomes a moral shield. Once you believe you're above something, an animal, a culture, a landscape, it stops being something you coexist with and starts being something you manage, exploit, or reshape. And the irony is that this sense of dominance often comes from insecurity, not confidence. A need to control because uncertainty feels intolerable. A need to own because sharing feels like loss. The danger isn't that humans think they're special. It's that we mistake capacity for entitlement. The planet doesn't belong to us. Other lives aren't raw material. Ideas aren't property by default. But we act as if they are, because that worldview has carried us this far, even as it frays everything around us. Story 30. We love to wrap ourselves in values. Freedom, rights, dignity, right up until those values become inconvenient or expensive. Then they become flexible. Abstract, someone else's problem. The land of the free condemns exploitation in speeches while quietly outsourcing it to places where suffering is cheaper and easier to ignore. We get low prices and clean consciences because the harm happens far away. What makes it worse is that everyone involved knows. Governments know. Corporations know. Consumers half know and try not to think about it too hard. The system runs on that shared willful blindness. Values become branding, not constraints. It's not hypocrisy by accident. It's hypocrisy by design. Global supply chains are built to separate benefit from responsibility. You enjoy the product, someone else absorbs the cost, and the distance makes it feel morally diluted. Out of sight, out of mind, but still very much real. That's why it feels like a lack of values rather than a failure to live up to them. If values only apply when they're profitable or comfortable, they aren't values at all. They're marketing. The unsettling part is realizing how normal this arrangement has become. Exploitation isn't a scandal anymore, it's infrastructure. And once a society accepts that, it has to work very hard to convince itself it still stands for anything at all. Story 31. Burning hydrocarbons is destabilizing the climate systems that make life possible. Heating oceans, acidifying water, collapsing insect populations, pushing ecosystems past recovery thresholds. The biosphere isn't fragile in the short term, but it is finely balanced. We're knocking out supports faster than they can adapt. And because humans depend on those same systems for food, water, and stability, we're not separate from the damage. We're downstream of it. What makes this especially grim is that it's not ignorance driving it anymore. The science is settled. The models were conservative. The warnings were early. And yet extraction continues because stopping would threaten profits, power structures, and short-term comfort. So we keep going knowing the cost will be paid later by people who didn't choose it. That's the pattern again. diffuse responsibility, delayed consequences, normalized harm. Climate collapse doesn't look like a movie. It looks like overlapping crises. Crop failures, migrations, wars, pandemics, each treated as isolated problems instead of symptoms of the same root cause. And still, the system insists on growth, consumption, and burning more to fix the damage caused by burning before. It's not that humanity wants to self-destruct. It's that we built an engine that rewards destruction and punishes restraint, and then convinced ourselves we're not allowed to turn it off. The tragedy isn't that we didn't know, it's that we knew early enough to stop, and chose not to. Story 32. Screens create distance, and distance erodes empathy. When you don't have to see someone's face, hear their voice crack, or feel the social cost of cruelty, conscience weakens. People start treating others like abstractions, avatars, usernames, ideas to attack, instead of humans to reckon with. Harm becomes entertainment. Outrage becomes sport. What's especially dark is how rewarded it is. Algorithms amplify cruelty because anger spreads faster than care. Mockery gets likes. Dehumanization gets engagement. And accountability disappears into anonymity or crowds. Everyone's doing it, it's just words, they deserve it. Responsibility dissolves the same way it does in large systems. No one feels like the one pulling the trigger. Social media didn't invent cruelty. Humans have always had it in them, but it stripped away the friction that used to slow it down. Shame, consequence, social correction, those were brakes. Now cruelty can be impulsive, performative, and risk-free. The part that hurts most is the normalization. People don't even see it as wrong anymore. They see it as honesty, humor, and strength. Compassion gets framed as weakness. Nuance gets buried. And genuine suffering becomes background noise unless it can be weaponized. But here's the thing that still matters. The internet didn't erase kindness. It drowned it out. And every time someone chooses to pause, to be decent, to refuse the easy cruelty, even when no one's watching, that's a small act of resistance against the current.